Chapter 22 of the Red Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laura Christ. The Red Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. Chapter 22. The Golden Branch. Once upon a time there was a king who was so morose and disagreeable that he was feared by all his subjects, and with good reason, as for the most trifling offences he would have their heads cut off. This King Grumpy, as he was called, had one son, who was as different from his father as he could possibly be. No prince equalled him in cleverness and kindness of heart, but unfortunately he was most terribly ugly. He had crooked legs and squinting eyes, a large mouth all on one side, and a hunchback. Never was there a beautiful soul in such a frightful little body. But in spite of his appearance, everybody loved him. The Queen, his mother, called him Curlicue, because it was a name she rather liked, and it seemed to suit him. King Grumpy, who cared a great deal more for his own grandeur than for his son's happiness, wished to betroth the prince to the daughter of a neighbouring king, whose great estates joined his own, for he thought that this alliance would make him more powerful than ever, and, as for the princess, she would do very well for Prince Curlicue, for she was as ugly as himself. Indeed, though she was the most amiable creature in the world, there was no concealing the fact that she was frightful, and so lame that she always went about with a crutch, and people called her Princess Cabbage Stalk. The king, having asked for and received a portrait of this princess, had it placed in his great hall under a canopy, and sent for Prince Curlicue, to whom he said that as this was the portrait of his future bride, he hoped the prince found it charming. The prince, after one glance at it, turned away with a disdainful air, which greatly offended his father. "Am I to understand that you are not pleased?" he said very sharply. "No, sire," replied the prince. "How could I be pleased to marry an ugly, lame princess?" "Certainly it is becoming in you to object to that," said King Grumpy, "since you are ugly enough to frighten anyone yourself." "That is the very reason," said the prince, "that I wish to marry someone who is not ugly. I'm quite tired enough of seeing myself." "I tell you that you shall marry her!" cried King Grumpy angrily. And the prince, seeing that it was of no use to remonstrate, bowed and retired. As King Grumpy was not used to being contradicted in anything, he was very much displeased with his son, and ordered that he should be imprisoned in the tower that was kept on purpose for rebellious princes, but had not been used for about 200 years, because there hadn't been any. The prince thought all the rooms looked strangely old-fashioned, with their antique furniture, but as there was a good library he was pleased, for he was very fond of reading, and he soon got permission to have as many books as he liked. But when he looked at them, he found that they were written in a forgotten language, and he could not understand a single word, though he amused himself with trying. King Grumpy was so convinced that Prince Curlicue would soon get tired of being in prison, and so consent to marry the Princess Cabbage Stalk, that he sent ambassadors to her father, proposing that she should come and be married to his son, who would make her perfectly happy. The king was delighted to receive so good an offer for his unlucky daughter, though, to tell the truth, he found it impossible to admire the prince's portrait, which had been sent to him. However, he had it placed in as favourable a light as possible, and sent for the princess, but the moment she caught sight of it, she looked the other way, and began to cry. The king, who was very much annoyed to see how greatly she disliked it, took a mirror, and, holding it up before the unhappy princess, said, "I see you do not think the prince handsome, but look at yourself, and see if you have any right to complain about that." "Sire," she answered, "I do not wish to complain, only I beg of you, do not make me marry at all. I had rather be the unhappy Princess Cabbage Stalk all my life than inflict the sight of my ugliness on anyone else." But the king would not listen to her, and sent her away with the ambassadors. In the meantime, the prince was kept safely locked up in his tower, and, that he might be as dull as possible, King Grumpy ordered that no one should speak to him, and that they should give him next to nothing to eat. But all the prince's guards were so fond of him that they did everything they dared, in spite of the king, to make the time pass pleasantly. One day, as the prince was walking up and down the great gallery, thinking how miserable it was to be so ugly, and to be forced to marry an equally frightful princess, he looked up suddenly, and noticed that the painted windows were particularly bright and beautiful, and, for the sake of doing something that would change his sad thoughts, he began to examine them attentively. He found that the pictures seemed to be scenes from the life of a man who appeared in every window, and the prince, fancying that he saw in this man some resemblance to himself, began to be deeply interested. In the first window there was a picture of him in one of the turrets of the tower. Farther on he was seeking something in a chink in the wall. In the next picture he was opening an old cabinet with a golden key, And so it went on through numbers of scenes, and presently the prince noticed that another figure occupied the most important place in each scene, and this time it was a tall, handsome young man. Poor Prince Curlicue found it a pleasure to look at him. He was so straight and strong. By this time it had grown dark, and the prince had to go back to his own room, and to amuse himself he took up a quaint old book and began to look at the pictures. But his surprise was great to find that they represented the same scenes as the windows of the gallery, and what was more, that they seemed to be alive. In looking at pictures of musicians, he saw their hands move and heard sweet sounds. There was a picture of a ball, and the prince could watch the little dancing people come and go. He turned a page, and there was an excellent smell of a savory dinner, and one of the figures who sat at the feast looked at him and said, "We drink your health, Curlicue. Try to give us our queen again, for if you do, you will be rewarded. If not, it will be the worse for you." At these words the prince, who had been growing more and more astonished, was fairly terrified, and dropping the book with a crash, he sank back insensible. The noise he made brought his guards to his aid, and as soon as he revived, they asked him what was the matter. He answered that he was so faint and giddy with hunger that he had imagined he saw and heard all sorts of strange things. Thereupon, in spite of the king's orders, the guards gave him an excellent supper, and when he had eaten it, he again opened his book, but could see none of the wonderful pictures, which convinced him that he must have been dreaming before. However, when he went into the gallery the next day, and looked at the painted windows again, he found that they moved, and the figures came and went as if they had been alive. And after watching the one who was like himself find the key in the crack of the turret wall and open the old cabinet, he determined to go and examine the place himself, and try to find out what the mystery was. So he went up into the turret and began to search about and tap upon the wall, and all at once he came upon a place that sounded hollow. Taking a hammer, he broke away a bit of the stone, and found behind it a little golden key. The next thing to do was to find the cabinet, and the prince soon came to it, hidden away in a dark corner, though indeed it was so old and battered looking that he would never have noticed it of his own accord. At first he could not see any keyhole, but after a careful search he found one hidden in the carving, and the golden key just fitted it, so the prince gave it a vigorous turn, and the doors flew open. Ugly and old as the cabinet was outside, nothing could have been more rich and beautiful than what met the prince's astonished eyes. Every drawer was made of crystal, of amber, or of some precious stone, and was quite full of every kind of treasure. Prince Curlicue was delighted. He opened one after another, until at last he came to one tiny drawer, which contained only an emerald key. "I believe that this must open that little golden door in the middle," said the prince to himself, and he fitted in the little key and turned it. The tiny door swung back, and a soft crimson light gleamed over the whole cabinet. The prince found that it proceeded from an immense glowing carbuncle, made into a box, which lay before him. He lost no time in opening it, but what was his horror when he found that it contained a man's hand, which was holding a portrait. His first thought was to put back the terrible box and fly from the turret, but a voice in his ear said, "This hand belonged to one whom you can help and restore. Look at this beautiful portrait, the original of which was the cause of all my misfortunes, and if you wish to help me, go without a moment's delay to the great gallery. Notice where the sun's rays fall most brightly, and if you seek there, you will find my treasure." The voice ceased, and though the prince, in his bewilderment, asked various questions, he received no answer. So he put back the box and locked the cabinet up again, and, having replaced the key in the crack in the wall, hastened down to the gallery. When he entered it, all the windows shook and clattered in the strangest way, but the prince did not heed them. He was looking so carefully for the place where the sun shone most brightly, and it seemed to him that it was upon the portrait of a most splendidly handsome young man. He went up and examined it, and found that it rested against the ebony and gold paneling, just like any of the other pictures in the gallery. He was puzzled, not knowing what to do next, until it occurred to him to see if the windows would help him, and, looking at the nearest, he saw a picture of himself lifting the picture from the wall. The prince took the hint, and lifting aside the picture without difficulty, found himself in a marble hall adorned with statues. From this he passed on through numbers of splendid rooms, until at last he reached one all hung with blue gauze. The walls were of turquoises, and upon a low couch lay a lovely lady, who seemed to be asleep. Her hair, black as ebony, was spread across the pillows, making her face look ivory white, and the prince noticed that she was unquiet, and when he softly advanced, fearing to wake her, he could hear her sigh and murmur to herself, Ah, how dared you think to win my love by separating me from my beloved Florimond, and in my presence cutting off that dear hand that even you should have feared